Hi, my name is Dr. David Eddy. I'm a clinical psychologist at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And today I'm going to be giving an introductory lecture on substance use disorder. In fact, this is going to be a two-part lecture. Today I'm going to be talking about the prevalence of substance use disorder. It's epidemiology, if you will. And then I'm going to talk about theories of substance use disorder development, i.e. its etiology. Before I do that, though, I wanted to give a little bit of historical context because I think you'd be forgiven for thinking that substance use disorder is a modern phenomenon. There's so much hysteria around substance use disorder. There's so much stigma. The reality is people have been using alcohol and other drugs for as long as they've known about alcohol and other drugs. We know there's evidence that as early as the 15th century BC, the Assyrians were using cannabis medicinally, but also recreationally. The Bible has dozens, if not hundreds, of references to alcohol and alcohol addiction. And we know that ancient Greeks and probably even societies before the ancient Greeks were utilizing opium both as a medicine, but also they were using it recreationally. And cannabis use, alcohol use, opioid use, other drug use has really been a part of most cultures since then. Right. So substance use and substance use disorder are not new phenomena, but I'd like to think the way we think about substance use disorder and treat this condition has come a long way. So how prevalent is substance use disorder? Well, let me show you some data from the Global Burden of Disease study from 2019. And it's estimated that in the US, about 7% of the population in the past year met criteria for substance use disorder for either alcohol or other drugs. Now, this doesn't include tobacco use. I mean, this is a staggering statistic when you think about it. I mean, 7% may not sound like much, but 7% of, say, around 300 million people, well, that's a lot of individuals with a current substance use disorder. And this also is noteworthy because it's probably an underestimate. We're probably undercounting, undercapturing the number of people who actually have a current substance use disorder. And we're also not capturing or factoring in folks who have recovered from a substance disorder, which in data I'll show in the second lecture is actually a sizable chunk of the United States population. In fact, we estimated in a recent study that around 23 million Americans endorse having overcome a significant alcohol or other drug problem. So you start to get a sense of how much of the population is affected by this condition. And in fact, epidemiologists will tell you, public health experts will tell you, substance use disorder is one of the most problematic, the most damaging mental health conditions in terms of its effects on public health. Problematically, too, substance use disorder tends not to travel alone. In fact, comorbidity or the co-occurrence of other mental disorders or psychiatric conditions with substance use disorder is really common. This is data from the National Institute of Drug Abuse here in the United States from 2017, indicating that about 38% of people with a substance use disorder also have some kind of other mental health condition. That could be certainly anything like a mood disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, or schizophrenia. So comorbidity is really common, and of course, that makes treatment and recovery from substance use disorder all the more difficult. So now I wanted to introduce some theories of substance use disorder, at least some of the more prominent theories. There's been a lot through the years. I'm going to start with the American disease model. Benjamin Rush, who was a founding father of the United States and was a physician, and later E.M. Jelinek, who was a physiologist initially at Yale and later at the Rutgers Center of Alcohol Studies. And finally, I think he finished his career at Stanford. He espoused this idea that addiction, and they were really focused on alcohol addiction, was a disease. As a medical condition. Now, this is really radical, especially in Benjamin Rush's day, because at that time, addiction, really any form of addiction, was considered a moral failing. If somebody had an addiction, there was something inherently wrong with them. Right? Benjamin Rush and later Jelinek said, no, this is a bona fide condition. People don't want to be addicted. They're not of weak moral fiber, let's say. They have a bona fide mental disorder. And later on, the American Medical Association, American Psychiatric Association, and the American Psychological Association all adopted this model. By the late 20th century, this really was the established theory. And really, it was characterized by the idea that addiction causes changes in the brain's structure and functioning. Also, that it's irreversible. Once you've developed an addiction, you never stop having an addiction, even though you can go in remission and stop experiencing the symptoms associated with addiction. And for Jelinek, he really thought that abstinence was really the only way that people could achieve addiction remission. Benjamin Rush took more of a middle path with this, and he thought that for some individuals, moderation was a realistic goal, that they could arrest their substance use disorder while continuing to use substances in moderation. But he also felt that for other individuals, especially those with more severe addiction, that really abstinence was the only way to go. So there's been a lot of other theories since then. And the self-medication hypothesis is a really popular one. Ed Kansian, who was at Harvard Medical School, who was a psychodynamically informed therapist, he observed and noted that individuals with substance use disorder are often medicating disturbing emotional states. They're trying to deal with psychological problems through substance use. And of course, that's effective in the short term. Alcohol and other drugs do give us short-term psychological relief, oftentimes, especially before an addiction has developed. The problem is they tend to stop working for folks. And ultimately, if addiction ensues, they end up creating more problems than they're solving. So Kansian really felt that people tended to gravitate towards particular substances based on how they were going to make them feel. So somebody who was very anxious and maybe hyper or over-aroused at the baseline may be more attracted to sedative hypnotics, like opioids, for instance. Whereas somebody who felt chronically understimulated, they might be attracted to stimulants. And later, Lance Dodds, he expanded this model. He was also psychodynamically trained to include a variety of psychosocial features. He really built out the self-medication hypothesis. Later, really around late 80s and the early 90s, the incentive salience model got a lot of play. And this was developed by Robinson and Berridge at the University of Michigan. And they really showed through a bunch of really elegant animal model research and human research that alcohol and other drugs hijack the reward centers of the brain, principally the mesolimbicortical dopaminergic system, which is really the reward system that is responsible for reinforcing behaviors that would have survival benefit. So when we eat food, especially when we're hungry, we get like a little surge of dopamine, and that's rewarding. That's of course going to help keep us alive. Sex is rewarding and also produces the release of dopamine. And what they really observed, what they showed, is that alcohol and other drugs really hijack this reward circuitry and are exquisitely adept at activating and producing massive amounts of dopamine release. And what they observed was that even though individuals would experience intense craving, they were often people with substance use disorder, they would have intense craving. They wouldn't necessarily be experiencing liking of the substance, especially in the later stages of addiction. So they were expressing wanting, like needing the substance really badly, but not liking it. And Robinson and Berry said, well, that's probably because the drug has hijacked this reward circuitry. So we become hyper-focused on the drug and getting it and ingesting it, even though we might not actually like the benefits it's producing or the effects it's producing anymore. The opponent process was first espoused by Sullivan I think in the mid 20th century. And he wasn't really an addictions researcher per se, but he observed that any kind of stimuli from the environment, it causes an initial response, whether that's physiological or emotional, which will in turn cause an opposite subsequent response. And he labeled these the A process and the B process. And this idea of opponent process has been applied in all kinds of theories of emotion, of physiological regulation, and even economics. So later, George Koob, who is currently the director of the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism in the United States, he really, with some other folks, adapted this idea of opponent process and showed how it could be at play in the development and maintenance of substance use disorder. So how does this play out in addiction? Well, the idea here is when somebody first initiates substance use, and this example uses heroin, but it could be any other substance, there's an A response or a rush or a high. Hedonic reward is produced. But of course, that doesn't last forever. As one metabolizes the drug, the hedonic reward reduces, and then often there's a period, a dip, if you will, below one's hedonic baseline, where maybe one's experiencing a mini withdrawal syndrome or it's just hungover. And then subsequently, the idea is that craving potentially will ensue because one wants to return to that state of hedonic reward, feeling high. And in the process of development of addiction, one repeats this cycle over and over and over again. But in doing that, one's resting state, so the hedonic baseline, is shifted because of effects of tolerance. One uses more and more substances to get the same effect, and also withdrawal effects, withdrawal syndromes become more and more pronounced the longer somebody has been engaged in substance use. So this often means that for people, particularly with well-established addictions, their resting state is not feeling good. And substance use, here heroin, is not really giving them a lot of hedonic reward. It's just getting them back to their previous baseline. People often say, I don't get high anymore. I just, sometimes get to a place where I feel sort of normal. Right? And that's often what people are going for, especially in the case of opioid use disorder. And the problem is when the drugs wear off, one is again in withdrawal, which can be really uncomfortable physiologically and psychologically. Right? So one is motivated, reinforced to continue substance use. So the opponent process is really pretty well established. It's not the only explanation for addiction, but it's one that can explain, at least for some people, how they develop substance use disorder. But it's more complex than that, right? Of course it is. And there's many biological factors that could be at play. And there's been tons of work done on the genetics of addiction. Of course, there's no one gene for addiction, but we do have genes that code stress hormones and liver enzymes that metabolize drugs. And based on how our genes are set up and how they produce hormones and enzymes, that can either increase or decrease our risk for developing a substance use disorder. And of course, then there's a direct pharmacological impact of substances like alcohol and other drugs on our body chemistry and in our physiology. And I spoke to tolerance and withdrawal before. This is really important for most individuals. As they consume more and more of a drug, they experience tolerance, where they need more and more of the drug to get the same effect that they used to get. And as well, withdrawal becomes more and more pronounced. The more one uses a substance, the more pronounced the withdrawal syndrome often is, and that can be incredibly reinforcing of substance use. Now, George Koob again and Nora Volkow, who's the current director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse in America, have described a three-stage neurobiological model of substance use disorder. And it's not just based on work from their labs, but the work of thousands of people really through the 20th into the 21st century. They've really synthesized or put together a lot of research, and they've shown that there's a binge intoxication stage of addiction where people are using substances. And here the brain areas typically associated with that binge intoxication stage are shaded in blue. Then withdrawal or negative affect ensues, sort of the down phase of the opponent process. the B phase. And those brain areas are highlighted in red. And then, of course, subsequently, there's the preoccupation or anticipation or craving stage. And those brain areas responsible for that stage are highlighted in green. And what we did in a recent paper with my co-authors, Marsha Bates and Jennifer Buckman at Rutgers University, we showed how heavily interconnected these brain areas are with the central autonomic network, which is really the neurobiological seat of emotional and behavioral regulation. So we showed, yes, that these brain areas are very, very important that Cooper and Bolko highlight in their three-stage model. But there are other brain areas, particularly brainstem areas, which are responsible for physiological regulation, which can explain a lot of the physiological effects of substance use disorder, and also can explain some of the vulnerability people experience, not just at the level of the brain, but also at the level of the body when we're talking about vulnerability for development of addiction and for its maintenance. And of course, there's psychological factors, and much research has been done exploring these. So we know that one's motivation to use alcohol and other drugs influences the risk for developing a substance use disorder. Of course it does. One's expectancies, what you think will happen when you use a substance, affects your likelihood of using the substance and also becoming addicted. Sensation seeking and impulsivity as well are highly correlated with substance use disorder, such that people who are high on sensation seeking or highly impulsive tend to be more likely to have a substance use disorder, perhaps not surprisingly. And of course, there's been a lot of research on the relationship between affect or emotions and the development of substance use disorder, and also individuals' coping capacity. And then there are sociocultural factors, right? One's culture and ethnic background, their norms and beliefs around substance use can have a major impact on whether they initiate substance use, whether they continue substance use, and whether in turn they develop a substance use disorder. Family history can be super important. Many individuals with addiction with substance use disorder come from dysfunctional family settings. Not all, but many do. Of course, peer influences can be very important. Social pressures can be in play, and media and social media can also influence substance use behaviors, and in turn have an impact on whether one will develop substance use disorder. And to all this, I would probably add spiritual factors as well. Now, some of my colleagues might roll their eyes at this, but we look at the work of poets like William Blake, psychologists like William James, who's really the forefather of modern psychology, who was at Harvard University, and Carl Jung, who was a student of Sigmund Freud. They all spoke about humans' search for meaning, need for connection with something better or bigger than them. And Jung actually, he wrote a lot about the disconnection experienced by humans as a result of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, where folks en masse moved from agrarian societies, living off the land, being very connected to the land, to factories and urban settings. And he really felt that a lot of the ills of the 20th century, including World War I and World War II, which he lived through, were a direct result of that disconnection, that humans had become disconnected from that thing that was bigger than them. They'd become marginalized, and that it produced, if you will, a soul sickness. In fact, Carl Jung did treat a lot of people with substance use disorder, and he really felt that though other factors were, of course, in play, he thought these existential factors, at least for some individuals, were also important. So wouldn't it be nice if we just had a unified theory that pulled all this together? Because obviously there's a lot of value that all these theories and models that I've spoken to just now bring to the table. And in fact, we do have a unified model. It's called the biopsychosocial model, or the biopsychosocial theory. Now, this might seem like a bit of a catch-all cop-out. Perhaps it is, but really, actually, when you drill down into it, it's an elegant way of understanding the inherent complexity of substance use disorder. It says, yes, there are biological factors in play. Of course there are. Yes, there are psychological factors in play. How could there not be? And certainly the social environment influences substance use behaviors as well, but it's always an interaction of these three things. And this is a great model. I really like it because it really allows for individual complexity. It allows for individuality. It says, yes, each individual can have their own unique path to the development of a substance use disorder. And that's important because then from there, we can start to think about tailoring treatments to individuals. If we recognize everybody's had a slightly different path to getting to an addiction, then we can develop treatments that address their specific vulnerabilities. So in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about diagnosing substance use disorder. I'm going to talk a little bit about stigma, and then I'm going to speak to treatment and recovery. Thanks so much.